Welcome to EWA's webinar. We have Andreas Schleicher from the Program for International Student Assessment, or PISA, who's here to talk about gender gaps in education and his thoughts on how that relates to the workforce. Mr. Schleicher, would you please begin?
Yes, thanks so much, Shrek. It's a great pleasure to share some of the findings with you. It's one of the most intriguing studies with the PISA data that we have done recently. When you think in terms of the most traditional metric of education, years of schooling, we have essentially seen that in terms of years of schooling, the gender gaps have already been closed in the 1960s. And yet we see significant wage gaps in the labor market between men and women, particularly at the top end of the pay scale. Some people say, that's to do with men and women getting paid differently for equal work. We have actually little evidence to support that, but one of the things that we have discovered is that a lot of that has to do with men and women pursuing different careers, and those kind of choices seem to be made much earlier than we traditionally think. But let's look at some of the data. Years of education, in the 60s, the gap was closed. And if you think about school performance today, you can see that in terms of reading performance, girls are typically ahead, and that's true in every country, in the United States as in other countries. In mathematics, the boys have still a sort of slight advantage. And in science, we can barely see any performance gap between boys and girls at the age of 15 on our PISA tests. I'm going to talk a lot about science, because keep in mind, science performance is roughly equal between boys and girls at the age of 15. One thing, though, is when you look in a little bit more detail, you can see that boys and girls have quite different strengths in science. Again, on average, they come out equally. Girls tend to be better in tasks that require them to identify scientific issues. The question, is something scientific, investigable, and so on. Boys are a lot better in terms of thinking like a scientist, basically explaining what they observe in scientific terms, and then using scientific evidence, gender gap is not very large. One of the things we see is this is about average performance, boys and girls, the difference. When you look at the lowest performing students, you can see that they are predominantly boys, marked here by the red dot. So boys are overrepresented among the bottom performers, but boys are also overrepresented among the top performers. So the variability in science performance is a lot wider among boys than it is among girls. Keep that in mind too, because we're going to come back to this again and again. I mentioned, performance isn't sort of that different between boys and girls, but attitudes, behavior, confidence varies actually quite significantly. One of the things we see, for example, is that boys tend to be a lot more confident in their abilities in science than girls. For example, learning advanced school science topics would be easy for me. That's what half of the boys are saying, but only around 40% of the girls. I can usually give good answers to test questions on school science topics. Also there, you can see boys overrepresented than girls. So even though boys don't do better than girls, they seem to be more confident in their abilities. When you look at the top-performing students in science, and remember, that's where boys were overrepresented. And I can basically see a significant performance advantage in most countries if actually boys and girls would have similar beliefs in themselves, in their scientific abilities. We would no longer observe gender gaps in science among the top performers in most of the countries. So you can actually explain the gender gap at the top end of the distribution to a large extent with the belief students have in their own abilities. We call that self-efficacy, but essentially that's what this concept is about. Let's look at the mirror image of confidence, and that's basically anxiety with mathematics. And here you see the pattern is the reverse. You can see that girls tend to be more anxious about mathematics, even if they do well. Even high-performing girls tend to show a greater degree of anxiety towards mathematics, science, than you can see among boys. I get very tense when I have to do mathematics homework. Despite the fact that we don't see much of a performance gap, we see a higher level of anxiety. Consistently across countries, in one way, that gets reinforced in stereotypes. Remember the Barbie doll in the 90s saying math class is hard? This is sort of something that seems to be deeply ingrained, but is not related to performance. Those attitudes are not an outcome of performance. They seem to be going beyond that. And that's basically what we have been looking at. To what extent, is performance predictive of what students do in the future? Or to what extent do those kinds of attitudes, behavior, confidence, actually relate to what students aspire to in their future? And we have some really interesting findings. Have a look at the data here. You can see, for example, that far more boys than girls expect to have a career in engineering or computing. The blue bar shows you the share of boys. The pink triangle shows you the share of girls. You take the United States, you have about 15% of boys expecting to have a career in engineering or computing, which is not very large by international standards. The United States ranks quite low on that. But among the girls, it's just 2.5%. And you can see that pattern actually quite consistent across countries. So lower levels of expectations in terms of careers. And again, remember, they perform the same. Performance among boys and girls on the science test is similar, but what they aspire to in their future, it seems to be that many girls see science more like a school subject, but not as something that is opening life opportunities for them. The current example is health services. There you can see basically girls being far more likely to expect a career in this than boys, particularly so in the United States. So it seems that those attitudes, expectations relate more closely to careers than the actual performance. Of course, that raises the question of what we can do about those things. We've tried to examine this from 3 angles. We've looked at factors that relate to parents, families, society. We've looked at factors that relate to teaching, school, instructional system. And we looked to the world of work. And we found actually a number of interesting relationships. Let's have a look at parents first. The first thing we see is that parents are more likely to expect their sons rather than their daughters to enter a career in the STEM fields, despite the fact, again, that boys and girls perform equally well in science. And you can see that the differences are quite significant. And you look to Hungary, 50% of the boys are expected to go into STEM, 20% of the girls. The exception are the East Asians. And that's actually a really interesting pattern as well. In East Asia, we find that boys and girls typically do really, really well. In fact, the girls in the East Asian countries outperform the girls and boys in virtually every other Western country. You can also see that the gender gap is typically small in science and math in those countries. And what you can see here, we have only for a few East Asian countries data, parental expectations don't vary as much as they vary in many other countries. But basically, you can see the career expectations that 15-year-olds express themselves are actually quite closely mirrored in what parents expect. So basically, if parents would be more open to girls aspiring to careers in the STEM area, maybe we would see different kind of attitudes, aspirations. It's at least an hypothesis. But I want to also look at, the underperformance of boys. We talked about, the top end of the distribution, but we've also seen that boys are overrepresented among the poor performers, particularly boys from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds. One of the things that we see is actually there are differences in gender in the volume of time that students spend on homework. Now, the blue bar, again, the boys, a pink triangle, the girls, and you can see in virtually every country, girls tend to do a couple of hours more homework per week than the boys. That's true for the United States. It's true for most other countries, too. Volume of homework. Why do I stress this? because we actually see a quite significant relationship between the volume of time spent on homework and performance. In fact, this is the gender gap as we observe it. We mentioned before, math boys a bit better, reading girls a lot better, science no gender differences. If actually girls and boys would spend an equal amount of time on homework, you could see that the boys would win a lot. They would catch up a bit in reading, they would extend their lead in math, and they would also be significantly doing better in science. So time spent on homework is another factor which parents can influence, and that is seen to be related to learning outcomes later in life, whatever the nature of the causal relationship. Another thing is, attitudes towards school. Here you see the share of boys that basically say that school has been a waste of time. That's about 15% in the average across countries, and about the same in the United States. And that share of girls having that kind of attitude to school is actually a lot lower, and particularly so in the United States. Again, something that relates, whether it comes from home or from school is not so clear here, but it relates to something that basically comes from the students. How do students spend their own time, their free time? Well, a very significant share of time is spent on the internet. We have measured this in PISA, and you can see basically for the countries for which we have data, you can see that is, you talk about 150, 160 minutes or outside the school during the weekend. That's basically over almost 3 hours. Outside school during the week is a bit less because kids go to school as well, and at school it's still sort of well over half an hour. And so time spent on the internet, quite important part of school time. Again, something that families can shape, can influence. Video games. And we have made a distinction here. One was one-player games, where you basically play on your own with the computer. And there you can see a quarter of the boys say they have never or hardly ever played those kinds of games. But it's the majority of girls. So there are actually quite important gender differences in the extent, the volume of time that boys and girls spend one-player games. Collaborative online games. The gender gap is even more significant. You can see 29% of boys saying they've never played those. Over 70% of girls say they've never played those kinds of games. Why is it important? Well, the good thing of PISA is that we can relate everything to performance. And one of the things that we see, some people say playing games is a bad thing. It's, it's going to detract from performance, taking time away, sort of a waste of time. But interestingly, the performance patterns are not so clear. For example, we can see that playing one-player games is actually related to better problem-solving skills, even better mathematics skills. Actually, all of those bars point upwards to the positive, to higher performance. Playing collaborative online games seems to be negatively associated with performance. It's hard to detect why. It's something that we can't see sort of so clearly. I mean, we actually have no data explaining those differences. One hypothesis is, collaborative games are often played late at night. You can't control your time because you need to play with other people, and they sort of eat up larger chunks of time at less convenient times, whereas in one-player games, students are more controlled. That's an hypothesis, but it's interesting that the performance pattern go in opposite directions. So we can't really say, internet and games is a bad thing. It really depends, but we can see those patterns. And if you now square that with the gender differences, you could see, you see why we can explain a fair share of the gender differences with the extent to which students play those games. Another part, obviously quite important, is what teachers can do about this. A couple of things that is important. First of all, our data show that boys and girls read quite different materials when they read for enjoyment, so basically when it goes beyond school. You can see, for example, girls tend to read more magazines. Boys tend to read more comic books. Girls are a lot more likely to read fiction, novels, narratives. Non-fiction book is about equal, and newspapers, it's again boys, and then sort of more. Why is it important? Well, think about what people typically read in school. This is largely about fiction, no? This kind of text. And this is something that boys just don't want to read in their free time. So if schools would be sort of reflecting the interests of boys and girls more equally in the kind of material that students are reading, perhaps the gender gap would be a lot smaller. And that's something, you know, looking more carefully at what the reading patterns, the reading interests of boys and girls are, reflecting that in the reading material could be a way to engage boys and girls more equally in the reading processes, which, as we know, are a very important sort of outcome of learning.
Yeah. That's fascinating material. It's a very, very rich study that we have here. I wanted to jump in a little and begin to ask you some questions that have come
Sure.
up from the attendees. So, first of all, can you put this in a U.S. context? How does the U.S. experience differ from the school kids in other OECD countries, both in terms of their academic achievement and their perspective about their education, their attitudes about their education?
Yeah, actually, in most cases, the kind of gender patterns are quite similar. The U.S. is sort of a rather typical country, quite close to the OECD average. When you look at overall levels of performance, you know, particularly in the field like mathematics, you know, boys and girls in the United States don't do particularly well. In many countries, you can say, you know, the girls in math do better than the U.S. boys and girls. No? So overall levels of performance are not that strong, but the gender gap is actually quite typical. We can see the same thing in the attitudes. In fact, I showed you in some of those cases those data. So these are pretty consistent patterns that we observe across countries.
Interesting. And I was very interested in the preponderance of boys who are, for whom school, or kids for whom school is not successful. There's 14% of boys at the very bottom who don't reach any benchmarks in any of the 3 PISA subjects, and 9% of girls. Now, is that a proportion that's changed over time, or is that static? Have you seen that for the last 10 years?
Actually, we have seen it for a number of countries with important changes. I mean, first of all, you see the East Asians where low performance practically doesn't exist. You know, students from, whether they are boys or girls, from privileged families, poor families, underperformance is extremely rare. Most students do succeed. So there are big differences across countries, whereas in the United States you have a pretty large share of very, very low-performing boys. And when I say low-performing boys, they don't even reach, you know, the most elementary skill levels. Most of our assessment is about advanced reading skills, using reading for learning. But you can actually say that this is a quarter of U.S. boys who haven't even learned to read in a sort of advanced way. But what's interesting, you ask about trends. A few countries that have seen quite significant changes. Poland would be a good example that was able to dramatically reduce the share of low-performing boys and girls. Germany has been quite successful in Europe. So there have been, in Portugal, there's been a number of countries where those patterns have been changing, which actually tells us this is an issue for public policy. You know, if these shares would be constant across countries and constant over time, you would argue that's a problem of society. It's not a problem of education, but they are not. They're actually changing and they vary across countries.
And what's the proportion of these two? So the report, let me back up a little bit. The report looks at 2 sort of gender issues. One is the group, the very boy-heavy group of kids for whom school really does not work very well. And the other end is the very high performers for whom advanced science and whose science careers and advanced math does not really work particularly well for girls, right? So when you think about numbers, are we talking about, what's the proportion of, for example, of the population we survey, what's the proportion of the low end to the high end of what we're talking about? If I were meeting with my state representative and I said, really, as an education expert, I think that you should be most vigorous in this area, which calls out?
You know, both ends of the distribution really matter. You have a quarter of of boys and girls with rather low performance, depending on the subject you're looking at, and that's a significant drag on, economic progress, social outcomes. Actually, later on, I'm going to show you some interesting data on that. But at the very same time, the people who innovate your economy, who innovate your society, who really advance social progress, they're at the top end of the scale, and that's also a quite important part of the distribution. And the United States actually used to be, it always had a quite large share of low performers, but it used to be quite strong at the top end of the distribution, and it's actually not anymore really the case. The United States is just sort of so-so, an average performer at the top end of the distribution. You have, to put it bluntly, the 10% most disadvantaged kids in the city of Shanghai, and those kids really live in very, very poor conditions. They outperform the 10% kids of the most privileged families in large U.S. cities. So basically, the U.S. used to be very good at the top end of the distribution, but that's not what we see in the latest comparisons. And not because U.S. has got worse, but because many other countries have just become a lot better on that.
So we have a question from Amanda Paulson from the Christian Science Monitor, and she asks, could you talk in more detail about the countries where gender gaps aren't so strong? And what are some of the lessons that might be drawn from those countries? Are there things we could Are there things that could be replicated in other countries? Thank you, Amanda.
Yeah, you've seen in the initial chart that the gender gap varies quite widely across countries. In East Asia, typically, boys and girls reach very, very high levels of performance. In Europe, you can see some countries with very large gender gaps, others with smaller gender gaps. The United States is sort of a typical country with a typical gender gap, and that's about performance. When you look at the attitudes, the patterns are actually more consistent across countries. So you can see even in countries that, for example, look at the Nordic countries in Europe that are not don't see very pronounced gender patterns in the performance, you can still see the kind of data, your career expectations, life expectations, relevance of school subjects. You can still see that that actually is something where those patterns also persist. And I think that tells us that those attitudinal aspects seem to be often get lost in public policy, but they are actually quite important. If we want to draw on all of the talent in our populations, they do actually matter.
We have a question from Sonali Kohli. She asks, do you have information on science anxiety? Do girls experience more science anxiety even though they perform close to the same as boys?
Yeah, in this latest survey, actually, we measured only anxiety with maths. We have data from 2006 that's really quite dated about science. They're actually quite similar, but they are quite sort of out of date now. But we're going to collect those data this year again.
There's a question about the passage of the report that says girls, even high-achieving girls, are also more likely to express strong feelings of anxiety toward mathematics. On average, across the OECD countries, the score point difference in mathematics performance between high-achieving girls and boys is 19 score points. However, when comparing boys and girls who report similar levels of self-confidence in mathematics and of anxiety towards mathematics, the gender gap in performance disappears. It's a very interesting passage. She asks, is it possible that those students don't have anxiety because they're good at math, or not the other way around? Really good question.
Yeah, actually, the chart that I showed you on this does control for math performance, because that's the obvious question to ask. Is that simply, you're not anxious because you're very good at this? But even if you control for performance, you can see that gender gap. So basically, boys and girls who do similarly well on math show very different levels of anxiety. And the same for self-confidence.
I love the overconfident, underperforming boys. Very interested in why you chose to measure and look at attitudes and perspectives towards school. What was your thinking in framing those questions, in trying to dig out that data?
Well, what we have seen, or also in previous PISA assessments, is that the gender difference in performance, particularly in a subject like science, cannot or do not explain why career choices are so different, why occupational patterns are so different, why life chances are so different, why wages are so different between men and women. So you can't explain that with test results, school performance. So we ask ourselves, can we capture some of the social-emotional components that may underpin those differences? And it was a pure hypothesis. We did not know that those relationships would be as strong as they come out in these data. But that was basically the idea. Can we capture, are there other domains, that are not related to student learning outcomes that shape those kind of student dispositions? And that's what we found.
One of the really interesting and rich sections of this report is about compliance grading and about kids who,
Yes.
about the gender differences in how children are graded and attitudes that they express that get rewarded or punished in a school setting. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, in fact, that's one of the slides I'm going to come to just in a moment. So you might want me to cover that then, but it's actually I find one of the most disturbing findings, which we do not know what the origin of this is, but the fact that teachers give different social groups different grades for similar performance is worrying, because it may help students in the short run. You get a better school mark, but it certainly doesn't help them in the long run.
Well, help them. I mean, boys are strongly disadvantaged in that scenario, right?
Yeah, a disadvantage when it comes to school marks, but they may also be more encouraged to try harder. Whereas girls, if they are given good marks for not so good performance, that may sort of disincentivize them to actually invest more in studying harder. So actually, the win for the boys is really just in terms of school marks, or the loss when it comes to performance at the workplace. That may actually turn out as an advantage. But I think it does show us that teachers need to become better at reflecting actual performance in the way they grade the work of students, rather than any projections they have about
you came to that conclusion, because I looked at that differently. I was like, well, boys are in a system where they're clearly disadvantaged by their attitudes or their gender, and we have high rates of dropouts for boys and high rates of boys who are not achieving. And of course, grades do matter. That's the way. That is the metric of school, right? For young people. So I looked at it a different way. That it wasn't that it incentivized them, but rather pushed them out of the system. Would that be a fair interpretation?
Possibly, but I think actually the United States is an interesting country where typically students are given better marks for sort of social performance than in many other countries. So if your hypothesis would hold, you would see no dropout in the United States, because students, all boys and girls, get relatively good marks. You would see much higher dropout in East Asia, where marks are really tough, and there's actually almost no dropout. I don't want to deny your hypothesis. This could well be one factor, but I'm not sure it's that easy. One of the things that we consistently see in PISA studies is that high-performing education systems typically have very, very high expectations of every individual student, regardless of their gender, regardless of their social background, and they support those students. Students feel, my teacher expects a lot from me, but my teacher will invest in me. One of the questions that we ask in one of our PISA studies is, what do you believe will make you successful in mathematics? And students in the United States and many European countries too would typically say, it's all about talent. If I'm not born as a genius, I study something else. If you ask that same question, in Singapore or in Shanghai, you get 9 out of 10 students telling you, if I try really, really hard, I trust my teacher is going to help me and I'm going to be successful. So basically, the belief in effort and hard work rather than talent or the social background or the school system is really one of the driving forces, and that is reflected in actually very high expectations, very tough marks. So I'm not sure, giving boys better marks is going to solve your dropout problem.
Yeah, I guess that's probably true. That's very interesting. It's very interesting, the idea that math is a product of talent, and that's certainly ingrained in the thinking in the United States, that math is a talent that you're born with, and that kids say, I'm bad at math when they're, in 4th grade. I guess there was some social science researchers who did a lot of cross-cultural examinations of those in the 90s and found that to be true, that in East Asian countries, math is seen as a product of effort, and achievement in math is seen as a product of effort. Do you think that the compliance grading issue should be something that is more broadly talked about in teacher preparation programs, or do you think it's a matter of, and tell me about that and the way it disadvantages girls. Tell me about that again.
Well, what we do see is that girls get better marks for not doing better than boys. Even when you control for student performance in math and reading, you can see that girls get better marks. In the short run, it's great. You get a better certificate in school. But, life doesn't reward you for your school certificate. Life rewards you for what you can actually do, what you know, and what you can do with what you know. And if, getting a good mark means you investing less in your studies, then in the long run, that's a disadvantage now. But I sort of coming to your question, compliance grading. What I read out of this data is that teachers and teaching has to become better at being really good at diagnosis. Identifying the strengths and weaknesses of boys and girls, being able to intervene, to personalize learning, to sort of embrace the kind of socioeconomic or gender diversity that happens with differentiated pedagogical practices. And that's something I think many education systems probably need to invest in, so that when teachers see performance, they do not see their projections or the expectations of kids, but they actually see what those kids can deliver or potentially deliver.
Fascinating. So at this point, I guess we can go back to, would you like to continue making your presentation, or would you like to continue to field questions? Which would you prefer?
I just a few more slides. I can finish them, and then we can sort of go back to the question and answers. One of the things is that another, we are talking about what teachers can do. We've seen that some teaching strategies seem to be particularly good at engaging girls in performance. For example, we see that where teachers ask them to solve problems independently. We call those things cognitive activation strategies, where basically a lot of responsibilities on the learner. We can actually see that there are significant score point advantages in mathematics, in particular for girls. So there seem to be specific instructional techniques, strategies that seem to be related to better performance. Here we arrive at the issue of compliance gradings. You can see the marks given by teachers in reading. You can see that basically girls are getting higher marks in all countries for which we have data, the United States included. And now you tell me, well, you told us before that girls do better, so obviously they get better marks. No? But now, with the blue dot, I actually control for performance. And you can see that still, in most countries, girls get better marks. The same is in math. Basically, once you control for performance, actually girls seem to be getting better marks, even though they perform equally well. So that's basically just, we talked about it, so I'm not going to go through this in any more detail, but that's basically the evidence and data underlying that. Last point really to make, is not just about families, it's not just about teachers and schools. There seem to be also some factors that relate to the world of work and the way in which schools in the world of work are integrated. One of the things that we found is that actually a lot of 15-year-olds do not know very much about how to prepare themselves for a job. And the girls are more likely not to know how to prepare themselves for a job interview. More than 40% of girls. So that's an issue, preparing boys and particularly girls better for actually the world of work interview. How do actually boys and girls learn about the real world, the world of work? And this is actually interesting that we did find kind of gender differences on this. You can see, for example, more boys, a greater share of boys have worked as an intern than girls. No? Blue bar boys, triangle girls. Job shadowing, more typical for boys than for girls. Visiting a job fair, they're sort of getting similar. Spoke to a career advisor, that's sort of similar. Spoke to a career advisor at school, also similar. Completed a questionnaire looking at the internet, that's where you see girls ahead. So basically, boys and girls seem to have different ways of getting experience with the labor market. You know, boys tending sort of to get first-hand experience, girls looking things up more indirectly through the internet. And that's something, you know, you can see employers potentially becoming better at engaging both boys and girls in the world of work. The last point I want to make, and that's really a striking finding, you know, we saw the huge advantage in reading skills among 15-year-olds of girls. When we look at 16 or 29-year-olds, suddenly that gap has disappeared. I must tell you, these are not the same students, so we can't really be sure that this isn't sort of some cohort effect. But I mean, the pattern is
somewhat. I didn't quite catch that.
These are not sort of. We do not know. You know, we know what happens to today's 15-year-olds and today's 16 to 29-year-olds. So we do not really know. Maybe there's happened something over those years that they became older. We can't. But so it's difficult to distinguish the age and cohort effects. But what is striking that across countries, the gender gap seems to, in reading, the gender advantage of girls seems to have disappeared. And we've tried to look at, you know, can we identify some factors that might explain why boys seem to be catching up at the workplace? And one of the findings that we had, one of the things that we saw is that men are actually a lot more likely to read at work than women. The gap is not as big in the United States, but if you looked at Japan, Korea, Austria, Norway, the Netherlands, and so on, it's actually quite important. Why is that the case? Why is the workplace typically more reading intensive for men than for women? We don't know. I cannot give you the answer to this, but it seems to be consistently the case. So actually, men seem to have more and better experience to use reading skills at work. And one of the things that we know is skills that you use, you develop. Skills that you do not use, you actually lose. So it's an hypothesis that actually the more reading and skill-intensive work that men do may be helping them actually to catch up, even in areas where they're not doing so well, like reading. You know.
Well, fascinating on the literacy. That to me is a real head scratcher. So as literacy is measured by school reading, no, you actually were measuring it by all reading, magazines, comic books, fiction, and nonfiction.
Right. Yeah.
You were saying that boys like to read different kinds of things, but that boys are behind in reading. So as reading is tested by the PISA exam among 15-year-olds, right? But when they get into the workplace, is that because what do we make of this data? Is that because the lowest performing boys, the ones who have fallen out and are not in the workplace? We have unemployment among boys than girls in general, right? So is that because the bottom is out of this?
It could be part of the explanation. I really do not know the answer, but I would also argue that, you know, the type of work that men seem to be doing may involve more and better reading skills than the type of work that women do in that age bracket. Employment, you know, I'm not sure in that age group is not so bad. So typically, I don't think you're going to explain a lot with this. But you know, I would have to look into this more carefully. But what we do know is that the reading advantage of 15-year-old girls seems to be disappearing, and that some of that seems to be related to more skill-intensive or more reading-intensive work that men do after school.
That I just can't understand where that comes from. I can't understand how the trend lines of boys being 38 points behind in reading, which I think is the number, which is more than a full year of schooling, right? Then catch up. Is it that that the PISA is measuring something that is not a workplace skill?
Yeah, you know, again, you know, that's something we just see the results here. How those kinds of changes occur, the patterns occur, is something that is beyond these kinds of data. That one would have to investigate this a lot more closely, and also preferably with true longitudinal data, following up on individuals, what happens to them. But one of the things that we do know is that careers are very different. You know, boys and girls choosing different career paths, and maybe that the type of careers that men choose may be more reading intensive than the type of career path that young women choose? I do not know the answer, but something seems to be in the reading patterns quite different between men and women in that
manufacturing, construction, agricultural sector, they're all male-dominated fields. That doesn't. It's super interesting. Super interesting. So we have another question from Amanda Paulson from the Christian Science Monitor. She says it's striking how much the attitudes and social emotional factors seem to influence the gaps. What do you think the best ways are to combat these differing attitudes, particularly the lack of confidence and the increased anxiety for girls and boys' belief that school doesn't matter?
Yeah, I think it's a very, very good question. I think we can learn something from the East Asian countries that basically do not see those kinds of gender patterns as pronounced. It's about, teachers having similar expectations for boys and girls, very little tolerance for failure, and then engaging and supporting boys and girls individually, providing sort of embracing that kind of variation with a lot of individual support. I think that's what we do see in many high-performing education systems in Northern Europe and Asia, that basically students sort of are all expected to succeed and all receive a high degree of personal support in various forms. If you look at Finland, for example, you have 1/3 of instruction time delivered outside formal classroom settings. So teachers have actually ample opportunity to address specific weaknesses and interests, and that probably is something also that helps on moderating anxiety.
We have another question from Sonali Kohli, who says, the hands-on experience, that slide that you put up, is that for 15-year-olds, she asks?
Yes, that's for 15-year-olds.
Right.
It's a PISA population, basically.
And Deirdre Fahey from International Ed News, I think she's talking about the literacy issues and men and women reading. Is that related to the types of jobs women and men have? Deirdre, if that's not your question, write a longer answer. So do you think the difference in how they read is related to their levels at which they read is related to their jobs?
Is a possible explanation, really. We only know that they do read more at their workplace than women, but is that the nature of the work, is the type of work, the field of study? These are not, we can't distinguish in that kind of data.
Deirdre also asks, I'm wondering about the teaching strategies mentioned. Is there evidence that teachers in Asia are engaging students in less collaborative classwork? Does that benefit girls?
Actually, there is a lot of collaborative classwork when you look for Shanghai or Japan, for example. They have a very strong tradition of engaging students in a lot of collaboration, and they have to, because classes are typically very large, so you cannot sort of have the kind of front-loaded education that works in many other countries. So that would actually, I don't have any kind of objective measures, but from what we know about East Asian systems, there's a lot of interaction and collaboration in the student group, so I'm not sure that could explain that. There is sort of one hypothesis, and unfortunately we don't have enough. One hypothesis is it better to teach boys and girls separately in science and math classes? And that's a question that we get often asked. We just can't investigate it because we don't have enough single-sex schools in this data set.
So Sonali Kohli from Quartz says, in regards to East Asia and countries you talk about, is the China data reliable to use? Since there was criticism that they only gave tests to a specific set of urban upper class middle students, are there any other data caveats we should keep in mind?
No, the data for the province of Shanghai that I showed you here, or for Hong Kong, Macau, they're absolutely comparable, absolutely reliable, they're comprehensive, they cover all 15-year-olds in those provinces. For the rest of China, we have not included data, and those data basically are just being developed. So, but for the parts of China for which we have shown you comparisons, you can actually be 100% confident that they are comparable to US data and data in other countries.
Very interesting. We have a few more minutes now to keep asking questions, so keep them coming. These have been great questions. You had mentioned that Poland had really done a great turnaround with some of their lowest performing students. Can you tell us a little bit about the practices there and how they affected the students?
Yeah, Poland embarked on a quite ambitious reform in the late 90s, 1999. It extended to many parts of the education system. It was about the structure of the education system. Basically, Poland detracked its school structure. Traditionally, had, like many European countries, had it divided students up into sort of different school tracks, vocational, academic. They basically deferred that, and that in itself had a very important result very quickly, namely that the variability in school performance declined dramatically. Before, the majority of the variability was lying between schools. After the reform, the majority of the variability lied within schools. That, of course, posed massive challenges for students that had to face a much more heterogeneous student population. So Poland began to invest in in addressing this, strengthening teaching capacity, improving resources, and together, one of the things that is quite striking in Poland that they pursued those kinds of reforms consistently over more than a decade. And you could see, from 2000 to 2003, 2006, 2009, 2012 on the PISA assessment, how those reforms actually, whatever they did in Poland, played out in reducing poor performing students in Poland, and later on also actually strengthening the top end of the skill distribution. Poland used to be a country that did worse than the United States in the early PISA tests, and is now a country that does a lot better than the United States in the PISA test. So it's actually a country that has seen very significant changes in performance, and it's an example that also shows us you actually can change outcomes. These outcomes are not frozen in time. They're not about poverty. They are really about what we do with children.
Here's one I know you'll be able to answer off the top of your head. How many students took the PISA in 2012 globally?
It's about, 500,000 students in every PISA assessment.
And that's Melissa Korn. Thank you, Melissa.
It's the most comprehensive and most rigorous international assessment that we have. So there's a lot of, there's a high degree of coverage in countries, and about 65 countries took part in the latest test, and then about 500,000 students actually get assessed now.
So Sonali says, the report says that girls are more likely to think school is important, and they care more about pleasing others, which could contribute to them choking on tests and getting lower test scores. Is this supported by classroom performance in any way?
I can't judge that. I think that this is a hypothesis that could be part of the explanation of girls wanting to do better, therefore being more anxious about good results is possible. It's not something that we could derive directly from this data.
Very interesting. Is there something else that you would like to elaborate on, or areas that we've skipped over that you'd like to drill down into a little bit?
I sort of, just in general, what I found really interesting, that you could almost say, reducing gender gaps and capitalizing on the talent of boys and girls is really something which, everybody can make a difference. It's not that something you would maybe solely look for public policy. Sure, you could see that some of the teacher-related variables seem to be sort of explaining part of this gender gap. But, again, if you look at the expectations of parents, the time, students spend at home doing other things than learning-related things. You look at employers, that they that boys and girls seem to be having different exposure to a work experience. So this is really something that is everybody's business, and I thought that it was a really interesting outcome from this work.
Well, we agree. Is there? I wanted to ask you another question that's come up. Is there was a PISA-based test for schools that was discussed at great length some months ago. It's something that schools in the U.S. and elsewhere can take to see how they stack up globally. What's the latest on that?
Yeah, it's actually an interesting development. We've got sort of one of the reactions that we often got from in countries was that schools came back to us and says, yeah, the average performance in my country isn't that great, but I really want to know, how do I stack up against schools in other countries or schools that are similar to mine in terms of the socioeconomic impact. So we developed this PISA for schools version where individual students can take the PISA test or test that actually is on that same metric, and then compare themselves against, their statistical neighbors, against the best performing schools around the world. And it's got a lot of traction in the United States. There are several hundred schools that have already done that. They get a quite detailed analysis back, not only giving them the average test scores, but looking at the performance of different socioeconomic groups. And it was an effort on our part to actually give schools better tools to actually, see themselves in a global environment. What was surprising to me is how much interest there was. That schools basically say we are no longer just interested how we compare against our neighboring schools or the schools in our state or country, but that there are many, many schools who actually do want to see themselves in a global picture.
You said several hundred schools have done this. You mean all over the world or in the United States?
In the United States. In the United States. In other countries, you have the same kind of offer now.
Well, that
the United States was actually the first country that actually piloted this, and it's been a quite significant development for us.
That would certainly be interesting territory to report on. So Sonali asks, what can parents do to improve the gap?
Well, I think the first thing is having similar expectations of your sons and your daughters. Making sure that we do not say just because it's a girl, I'm going to expect less in math and science, and maybe not so much in terms of a scientific career. And I think this is very important to show children that they can achieve. We did another interesting question that we once asked to parents was, and that explained a lot in outcomes. How often do you ask your children how was school? And this simple question of asking kids, how was school, explain as much as the family income. So it actually shows, just indicating to my child, this actually matters to me. This is really important to me. It's something that could be, a very important factor that shapes those kinds of activities and ultimately learning outcomes.
Deirdre Fayou is right on that issue of the PISA test that individual schools took. She said, are the results confidential, and will they be shared? Go, Deirdre.
It's an interesting point. Actually, the principle is that we actually do give schools their results back in confidence. It's up to the schools to decide whether they want to make them public. But in fact, many schools have put them on the web, and many schools have agreed that the reports can be shared. But the decision is with the schools. Our principle is that the school is owning its data and decides how it wants them published.
Although I believe Eric Henyushek did some research that showed how individual states measured up, right, against the PISA, PISA measure.
Mm-hmm.
So that's publicly available.
You can the work from Hanushek actually does show you, state performance, and that's true for many countries. We have data now at the level of states and sometimes districts.
Yeah, very interesting. I haven't seen any for districts publicly released for districts in the United States. Have you?
There are a couple of districts that have taken international tests in the United States, but it's sort of a very limited number still.
Right. All right. If there's not any other questions, I think we'll wrap this up. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for taking the time, and for all the people who tuned in on the webinar. Thank you for your great questions and for your attention. I hope it was useful for you. So good night now.
Thank you very much.